Welcome to WikiPodcast. Today we're diving deep into the very beginnings of belief in our religion series. The first myths, what ancient people believed and why.
Yeah, and our goal in this deep dive is really to explore the roots of religion through this fascinating world of myth. We want to try and uncover what these myths were all about for ancient societies and, crucially, why they even came into being. We're drawing from a source that really unpacks the whole idea of myth, from its earliest meanings right up to how we think about it today.
Okay, sounds great. Let's get right into it then. When we talk about myth, what are we actually talking about? What is a myth, fundamentally?
That's the perfect starting point. The word itself, myth, it comes from the ancient Greek mothos.
Mothos, right.
Yeah, and it could mean speech, narrative, or even fiction. And the actual study of myths, that's mythologia.
Okay.
Now, here's something really key, something that might surprise you. When scholars, academics talk about myth, they're not necessarily saying it's untrue.
Oh, right. Unlike how we use it sometimes in everyday conversation.
Exactly. Unlike the common usage. For academics, veracity or truthfulness isn't really the defining factor.
So it's not just about whether something literally historically happened or not?
Precisely. For scholars, a myth is more a genre of folklore, one that plays a really fundamental role in society.
Okay.
And these stories, they're often supported, endorsed even, by religious and sometimes even non-religious authorities.
Interesting.
And what's fascinating is that many ancient societies, they genuinely consider their myths and legends as, well, factual accounts of their distant past.
Wow. So not just stories, but history to them.
In a sense, yes. Think about creation myths, for instance. They typically describe a primordial time, like an age before the world took its current shape.
Okay, a time before time almost.
Yeah, exactly. These weren't just simple stories. They were seen as the very foundations of their understanding of reality.
Right. The bedrock.
Precisely. And then you also have what are called origin myths. These explain how a society's customs, its institutions, even things we might think of as taboos, how they came to be established and why they're considered sacred. These narratives basically provided a blueprint for how people should live, and they made sense of their place in the cosmos,
A blueprint. I like that. It sounds like these myths weren't just told, they were kind of the scaffolding of their whole world.
That's a great way to put it, the scaffolding.
Now, our source gives us a few really interesting scholarly definitions that dig a little deeper into this.
Absolutely. Let's look at one from Lauri Honko. He was a Finnic folklorist. He defines myth as fundamentally a religious account.
A religious account.
Yeah, of how the world began, of creation itself, key events, and, importantly, the exemplary deeds of the gods.
Exemplary deeds, like setting examples.
Exactly. Actions that, according to Honko, established the order of the world and reinforced a society's core religious values and norms. He also highlights that myth provides models for behavior. It testifies to the efficacy, the power of rituals, and establishes the sacredness of religious practices of the cult.
So it's way more than just a story. It's like a guide for living, almost a how-to manual for a culture's beliefs and practices.
That's a great analogy, yes, a how-to manual. Then we have Jose Manuel Asada, who studies myth criticism.
Okay.
He sees myth as a functional, symbolic, and thematic story. It's about extraordinary events and, crucially, involving transcendent, sacred, and supernatural elements.
Right. The supernatural aspect is key.
Very key. He also points out that these myths, in principle, lack historical testimony, historical proof. And they often refer to these really fundamental questions about beginnings or endings, cosmogony or eschatology.
For individuals or the whole world?
Both, yeah. Individual or collective, the big questions.
The extraordinary events and supernatural elements you mentioned, that really emphasizes that these are stories going beyond the everyday, tapping into something bigger.
Exactly. And there's one more definition from Annette and Christian Zgoll from their work on something called holistic myth research.
Holistic, okay.
Yeah, it's about the material of myth. They define myth as a narrative material. They use the German word Erzählstoff, raw story stuff, basically.
What's story stuff? I like that.
And this material combines interpretations of experience, like deep human experiences, into a sequence, a narrative that claims relevance for understanding the human condition itself.
Wow. So it's polymorphic, polystratic, adaptable, layered.
Precisely. Polymorphic, polystratic, those words captured perfectly. Myths aren't fixed. They can evolve, be understood in different ways across time, across cultures, and that claim to relevance for understanding the human condition part. that really underscores their profound and enduring purpose.
It gives them weight, doesn't it? Now, we should
Yeah.
probably reiterate, the way we often use myth in everyday chat is quite different from these scholarly takes, right?
Oh, absolutely. Crucial distinction. In everyday language, like you said, myth often just means a popular misconception or, frankly, a false story.
Yeah, that's just a myth.
Exactly. And this usage, it can sometimes be negative, pejorative even. Historically, it partly comes from people dismissing the religious beliefs of other cultures as simply incorrect or untrue.
Right, labeling their beliefs as myths makes them seem less valid.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's kind of a loaded word in that context, which is why scholars are so careful to define it more neutrally, especially when we're examining ancient worldviews. It carries that implication of falsehood, which, as we've discussed, isn't really part of the academic understanding here.
Okay, that distinction is super important. So we have a better grasp of what a myth is in this academic sense. Now, who are the main players? Who are the central figures in these foundational narratives?
Right, the characters. Typically, the main characters were non-human.
Non-human.
Yeah, think gods, demigods, other kinds of supernatural beings. Of course, you also find humans or animals, sometimes combinations.
Hybrids.
Yeah, hybrids too. But the primary focus tends to be on these extraordinary figures who operate outside the realm of, well, ordinary human experience.
So not your average Joe back then.
Not usually, no. Stories about everyday human leaders or, say, heroes, those are generally classified differently, usually as legends.
Ah, legends. What's the difference there?
Well, legends are often thought to have some kind of basis, however tenuous, in actual historical events or figures,
Yeah.
even if those events get massively exaggerated over time.
Okay, so a kernel of history, maybe?
Maybe. Whereas myths, particularly those dealing with gods and that very distant primordial past we talked about, typically don't have that same direct connection to known historical figures or specific events. That distinction between myth and legend is a useful one to keep in mind.
Yeah, it highlights that myths often deal with the divine creation, the cosmic order, while legends might focus more on human actions within a more recognizable, even if ancient, reality.
Exactly. Although, as our source points out, the lines can sometimes blur. You definitely find narratives that blend elements of both.
Makes sense. Okay, so we know what myths are, who's usually in them. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Why? Why did these first myths arise? What are some of the big ideas about their origins and the purpose they served?
Yes, this is a fascinating area, with several key interpretations proposed over the years. One really prominent theory is functionalism.
Functionalism, okay.
This perspective suggests that myths play a vital, active role in shaping society and guiding social behavior. They provide models, like we said, for how people should act.
Right, the blueprint idea again.
Exactly. And they also offer a connection to that sacred mythical past, which enriches religious experience. Think about it, maybe reenacting a creation myth through a ritual that could be seen as a way to actually reestablish the conditions of that original sacred time, maybe for healing or ensuring fertility, something vital like that.
Wow, so these stories weren't just passive entertainment. They actively shaped how people lived, interacted, even how they tried to influence the world around them.
Precisely. Then there's euhemerism. This is a really intriguing idea.
Euhemerism. How do you spell that? Doesn't matter. What is it?
E-U-H-E-M-E-R-I-S-M. It suggests that myths might actually be distorted memories of real historical events.
Seriously, like actual history warped over time.
Yeah, the idea is that over generations, the stories get embellished, exaggerated, until the human figures involved slowly become seen as gods, and the events take on a supernatural quality.
Whoa,
It's like ancient historical figures getting a massive PR boost that just kept growing.
That's a wild thought. That gods might have started as actual people whose stories just got bigger than life.
It is. It's a fascinating perspective. Another theory is allegory. This proposes that myths began as symbolic ways of understanding things.
Symbolic of what?
Either the natural world, gods representing the sun, the moon, the sea, that kind of thing, or perhaps allegories for deeper philosophical or spiritual ideas. Abstract concepts embodied.
Okay, so the stories were never meant to be taken literally. They were always symbolic.
That's the idea behind allegory, yes. Like a kind of code embedded in the narrative, pointing to deeper truths about the world or human nature.
A code. I like that.
Then, similar but slightly different, is the idea of personification. This suggests myths arose from ancient people attributing human-like qualities, agency, to natural objects and forces.
Like the wind having a will.
Exactly. They might have initially just revered something like fire or the wind, but gradually came to see them as conscious beings with personalities, intentions, which eventually led to them being seen as gods, being deified.
So it's like they were mapping human consciousness onto the world around them and then building stories about these personified forces.
Yes, giving agency and narrative structure to the phenomena they observed and experienced.
Okay, that makes sense too. What else?
Finally, there's ritualism. This theory posits a very strong link between myth and ritual.
Myth and ritual are connected how?
Well, the more extreme version of this theory even suggests that myths actually arose to explain existing rituals. Rituals whose original purpose or meaning had been lost over time.
Wait, so the practice came first and the story was invented later to make sense of it?
That's the extreme ritualist argument, yes. The myth provides a justification, an origin story, for a ritual that people were already performing but maybe didn't fully understand the why anymore.
Huh. That's a fascinating reversal of what you might expect. It really highlights the complex and probably debated relationship between belief and practice in ancient societies, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. They were likely intertwined in very complex ways.
It's incredible to see all these different interpretations, how they've emerged and evolved as scholars have tried to get their heads around these ancient stories, which kind of leads us naturally to the history of studying myths itself. When did people start to critically analyze these narratives?
Well, critical interpretation, questioning the literal truth, really began way back in ancient Greece with the pre-Socratic philosophers.
For Socrates. Okay.
Yeah. And as we mentioned briefly, Euhemerus, the guy behind Euhemerism, was a key early figure trying to interpret myths as distorted history. Even Plato,
The philosopher Plato.
the very same. While he actually had some concerns about using poetic myths, especially the more unruly ones, in education.
He thought they might corrupt the youth.
Something like that, or give the wrong ideas about the gods.
Yeah.
But interestingly, he actually used myths himself quite extensively in his own philosophical writings, as allegories or illustrative stories.
Oh, interesting. So he saw their value, just maybe not taken literally.
Exactly. And later followers of Plato, the Platonists, they really focused on digging out the symbolic meanings hidden within the myths.
So even way back then, there was this tension, literal truth versus deeper symbolic meaning.
Absolutely. That debate is ancient itself. Then, interest in mythology kind of lay dormant for a while, but it saw a big resurgence during the European Renaissance.
Your Renaissance.
Yeah, with the rise of what are called early mythographies. These were essentially collections and systematic descriptions of myths, often from classical antiquity. It was like a rediscovery, a cataloging of these ancient stories.
Like people were dusting off these old narratives, bringing them back into the light and trying to make sense of them again after a long time.
That's a good way to put it. But the 19th century, that's when we really see the emergence of the first properly modern scholarly theories of myth.
Okay, things get more systematic now.
Yeah, and this period was heavily influenced by some major intellectual currents. Romantic nationalism, the expansion of colonialism, which brought Europeans into contact with many diverse cultures and their mythologies, and also prevailing evolutionary ideas about human development.
Right, like Darwinism and ideas about social evolution. That must have been a real turning point applying these new frameworks to understand ancient beliefs.
It absolutely was. This is when we see the development of nature mythology.
Nature mythology.
Yeah, the idea that myths were basically metaphorical explanations for natural phenomena, storms, seasons, the sun's movement, and they represented early, supposedly primitive attempts to understand the world through animism.
Animism, believing natural things have spirits.
Exactly. And a key figure here was Max Miller, who famously, and rather dismissively, called myth a disease of language.
A disease of language.
Yeah. He thought myths arose from linguistic misunderstandings, like words losing their original meanings and sparking imaginative, but ultimately incorrect, stories about nature gods. It really reflects that 19th century view of myth as maybe a less sophisticated, earlier stage of thought.
Definitely sounds a bit condescending from our perspective now.
It does. Then you also had the ritual school, associated with figures like Sir James Frazer, author of The Golden Bough.
Ah, Fraser, I've heard of him.
Right. He and others in this school tended to see myths as misunderstandings or perhaps narrative elaborations of earlier magical rituals. They often proposed this kind of linear progression.
A progression.
Yeah, from magic to religion, and finally culminating in science as the supposedly most rational way of understanding the world. This idea of a neat, step-by-step evolution of human thought was very influential at the time.
That seems very characteristic of that era, that kind of ranking of ways of thinking.
It is, yeah. But then the 20th century arrives, and things get much more diverse. You see a much wider range of approaches.
Like what?
Well, you get psychoanalytical perspectives from Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, looking for connections between myths and the unconscious mind, archetypes, that sort of thing.
Right, Jung and archetypes.
Exactly. Then structuralist theories, most famously from Claude Lévi-Strauss, who focus less on the content and more on the underlying patterns, the binary structures within myths across different cultures.
Looking for the universal grammar of myth, almost.
Kinda, yeah. And functionalist viewpoints continue to be important, like with Bronislaw Malinowski, who really emphasized studying myths within their specific cultural context to see the social roles and functions they perform there.
So how they actually worked in a living society.
Precisely. Even people like Roland Barthes started looking at how modern phenomena, advertising, wrestling, whatever, could function as myths in contemporary society.
So applying the idea beyond ancient stories.
Exactly. And significantly, with the increasing secularization of Western society, scholars began to analyze narratives from the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, through the lens of myth as well, which was quite controversial for some.
And I can imagine, so the very definition of what could be considered and studied as myth really expanded.
It absolutely did. And the ways of analyzing myths became much more diverse, more complex.
And what about now in the 21st century?
The 21st century continues this trend, I'd say. There's a real emphasis now on the plasticity, the fluidity, the adaptability of myths.
Less searching for one true version.
Exactly. Less focus on trying to reconstruct some hypothetical, single, original version of a myth, and more interest in understanding the many different forms and meanings they take in various contexts and through time. We also really recognize now that myths aren't just conveyed through written texts.
Right, like oral stories.
Oral traditions, absolutely, but also films, visual arts, music, video games, a whole multitude of media.
That makes perfect sense in our world today, doesn't it? Stories are everywhere, across so many platforms.
Precisely. And that holistic myth research we touched on earlier.
Yeah, the Erzähl stuff, the story stuff.
Exactly. That's a more recent development that tries to systematically extract the core mythical elements, the hylemes, from all these different media, text, image, game, whatever, to allow for comparisons across these various forms of storytelling. It's a very detailed, analytical way of looking at the building blocks of myth.
Fascinating. So, okay, we've covered a lot of ground on what myths are, theories about their origins, how we've studied them. But why should you, listening to this right now, care about these ancient beliefs today? What's the ongoing relevance?
Well, it's huge, actually. The language, the patterns, the structures of mythological storytelling are still incredibly influential in modern culture. You really do see it everywhere.
Where, for example?
But in digital media, popular culture, TV shows, movies, and definitely, as we mentioned, video games. Modern visual storytelling, in particular, owes a massive debt to ancient mythology. Think about how many contemporary films draw directly on ancient mythic structures and archetypes. The whole hero's journey narrative framework.
Oh, yeah, that's classic.
That's straight out of myth analysis. You can see echoes of ancient heroes, gods, monsters, quests in so many of our modern superhero narratives, fantasy epics, even science fiction.
It's true, like you can trace the lineage almost.
Absolutely. Think about a company like Disney. They've built a global empire largely on essentially reimagining and retelling traditional myths, legends, and fairy tales for new generations.
Good point. They definitely mine that territory.
And even think about something like fan fiction online.
Fan fiction, how does that fit?
Well, you could argue it's a kind of modern, decentralized form of myth-making. People taking existing characters and story worlds, which often have their own mythic qualities, and creating new narratives, exploring different possibilities, participating collectively in this hyper-connected story world.
Huh. I hadn't thought of it that way. It's like people are constantly engaging with and reshaping these fundamental narrative patterns.
Exactly. It's almost like the deep human need for these foundational stories, these ways of understanding the world and our place in it, hasn't disappeared at all.
It just finds new forms, new outlets.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The forms change dramatically from oral traditions around a campfire thousands of years ago to, global blockbuster movies or interactive games today. But that underlying human drive to create meaning, order, and connection through narrative seems to endure.
Okay, so let's try and sort of unpack what this all means. We've taken quite a journey here through the definition of myth, exploring the various theories about why they emerged in ancient societies and seeing how these foundational narratives, these ancient ways of thinking, continue to echo and shape our modern world.
Yeah, and here's where it's really interesting, I think, for you listening. When you think about these first myths, these ancient explanations for the world, can you see echoes of those structures, those ways of explaining things, in how we understand the world and our place in it today? Are our modern stories, our sciences, our ideologies, even our personal beliefs, are they in some ways descendants of these ancient ways of making meaning? It really makes you wonder about the enduring power of these primal narratives, doesn't it?
It really does. So what does this all mean for you, our listener? Well, perhaps it offers a new perspective, maybe a new lens through which to view not just ancient religions, which is fascinating in itself, but also the stories, the beliefs, the narratives that shape our own modern lives.
It encourages us to think a bit more critically, maybe, about why certain stories resonate so deeply with us, why we keep telling versions of them, why we continue to create and consume them in all these different forms.
It's like an invitation, maybe, to become more aware of the narratives that surround us every day and to consider their origins, their functions, and the deeper meanings they might hold for us, individually and collectively.
Exactly. Food for thought.
Definitely. Thanks for listening. Write us in the comments your opinion on the episode and what other topics you would like us to talk about. Subscribe to the channel to help us reach more listeners. Thank you and have an amazing day.